If you know anyone going through chemotherapy, they should listen to this. When they combine fasting with chemotherapy, fasting right before the chemotherapy session, more of the cancer cells are killed and there are fewer side effects for the patient. How did they find out about this? They were doing some other kind of research on, I think it was Alzheimer's, and they were using a toxin. They found that fewer of the mice who had been fasting died than the ones who hadn't been fasting. And they realized that somehow the fasting had protected those mice from the toxin. So then the researchers got to thinking, well, chemotherapy is using a toxin to kill the cancer cells, right? And the side effects are because it's a toxin, and so it kills healthy cells too. So then they thought, well, maybe using it fasting before chemotherapy might help. So they've been doing it on mice for years now, different kinds of cancers. And sure enough, more of the mice live and live longer if they fasted before the chemotherapy session. Why would that be? They found one of the effects of fasting is that it causes cells to shift from growth and reproduction over to maintenance and repair. But cancer cells don't make that kind of shift from fasting. They actually become more voracious. Cancer cells are notorious for really using resources, kind of hungrily gobbling up resources. And when they are fasted, they don't have a normal healthy cell kind of reaction. They react by opening themselves more. So you have a double whammy. You have healthy cells kind of hunkering down and protecting themselves, and you have cancer cells opening themselves up and reaching for more. So the healthy cells are less affected by the chemotherapy and by the toxins in the chemotherapy, and the cancer cells are affected more. They take in more of it, and it kills more of them. This is exactly what you would want to enhance a chemotherapy session. You can read a really good article about these studies in Scientific American. It's an article called Fasting Might Boost Chemo's Cancer-Busting Properties. The lead researcher is named Walter Longo. He does a lot of research on fasting. And he says that they fasted the mice 2 or 3 days before a chemotherapy session. And he said that would be the equivalent in a human of 4 or 5 days. There's also a good video that covers a lot of things about fasting, but they cover some of the research on these studies on chemotherapy. And one of the things they pointed out in the film is that fasting before chemotherapy is the exact opposite of what is normally recommended before a chemotherapy session. They know that you're going to lose your appetite because that's one of the side effects from chemotherapy often is nausea. And so because you're going to lose your appetite after the chemotherapy, they recommend that you eat extra before the chemotherapy. Also in the video, you can see that they've actually started human trials on this protocol. And there was one lady in there that was a county judge who had been diagnosed with breast cancer and decided that if she waited until the human trials were done, she'd already be dead. So she decided to try it on herself anyway. And she did. She was scheduled for 5 sessions of chemotherapy, and she fasted before the first one. I can't remember, but I think she fasted 48 hours before the first chemotherapy session. And she felt fine afterwards. And then the doctors talked her out of doing it. So for the next 2 sessions, she didn't fast before the chemotherapy session, and she felt horrible after both times. And then she changed her mind and went back to it and fasted before the last 2 chemotherapy sessions. And she said she felt fine afterwards. Well, that's just one anecdote, but they also there's several people that have, they've read about these studies and they wanted to try it for themselves. They didn't want to wait for human trials. This is their life that's at stake, right? It's like, go ahead and experiment. I think it's a great idea, but in the meantime, I want to save my own life. So they've done it, and then they surveyed some of these people afterwards, and they found that they had less fatigue, less nausea, fewer headaches, and less weakness, muscle weakness or feelings of weakness, which is all of these are normal, typical kind of side effects of chemotherapy. When we come back, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the history of using chemotherapy for cancer. And now, a word from our sponsor. This episode is sponsored by Anchor, which is a a platform that allows you to make podcasts, and it's what I'm using right now. It's really easy to use. It's free. It's got editing tools. They help you distribute the podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and so on. And they make it easy to make money on your podcast by making it possible for you to add ads. You can download the Anchor app for free, or go to anchor.fm to get started. Ken Burns did a really good documentary on the history of fighting cancer. Ken Burns is somebody that does great documentaries and famous documentaries on like the Civil War and Vietnam War, Prohibition. He's done all kinds of really good documentaries, but he did one on the history of cancer, fighting cancer. And they started with the whole kind of fight against cancer started with a hospital that was treating childhood leukemia. If you got childhood leukemia, it was pretty much a death sentence. The survival rate was almost zero. There was a man who worked down in the morgue that was, constantly seeing all these children that had died of childhood leukemia. And he felt frustrated and helpless and just heartbroken at just seeing this death all day long, every day. And he decided he was going to try to do something about it, even though he wasn't a researcher and he wasn't a doctor even. But he started thinking about, well, maybe you could poison it. Maybe you could poison the cancer. Maybe you could give somebody enough poison that it would kill the cancer, but not quite kill the person. So he started experimenting with it. I mean, there was really almost nothing to lose. It was such a near 100% fatality from this disease. There was really nothing to lose. So they tried it on a few people, and they found that it did kill the cancer cells, but that the cancer cells responded by adapting. And then they thought, well, what if they had two different kinds of toxins they used at the same time? And they tried that, and it worked even better, killed more of the cancer cells. Apparently, some of the cancer cells tried to adapt, but how they tried to adapt ended up the other toxin killed them. So then they tried 3 toxins, and it worked even better. And then they tried 4 toxins, and it worked even better. And that's the protocol now, is they use 4 toxins. And they went from an almost 0% survival rate to now it's more like 85 to 90% survival rate from childhood leukemia. And that was the beginning of really a long process of trying to fight cancer and finding different ways to fight cancer. I just realized I didn't tell you the name of that video I was telling you about earlier. It's called The Science of Fasting. You can find it on YouTube right now. Hopefully you'll be able to find it there in the future. But back to the Ken Burns documentary, though. It's called The Emperor of All Maladies. And they cover a lot of different ways that they've been dealing with cancer all along, including some things that they're just trying now that are very different, very experimental ways of dealing with cancer. But it does show that chemotherapy has made a huge difference. And with this, adding this fasting in before chemotherapy sessions, seems like it's going to make it even better. So if you know anybody who's going through chemotherapy or who's about to start going through chemotherapy, you should send them this podcast, or find the article, Scientific American article, or the video on fasting, and let them know that there's something that they can do that will enhance the effect of that chemotherapy, and probably kill more of their cancer cells, and probably harm them less, and give them fewer side effects. And even if, most people's reaction, if they've never fasted before, is like, oh man, I don't think I could do that. I'd be suffering so much. Well, I've fasted for up to 14 days before. And it's really not as bad as you would think. And as a matter of fact, I made a podcast while I was fasting 14 days. It's called What's So Great About Fasting. And I kind of chronicle what it was like throughout the fast. And it's really not as bad as you would think. It's surprisingly not as bad, and it's certainly not as bad as the side effects of chemotherapy. So, you could suffer beforehand with some hunger pangs, or you could suffer afterwards with nausea and fatigue and so on, right? So it's definitely worth thinking about. And so if you know anybody that's going through chemotherapy, you should let them know about it. Okay, this is Adam Lee Kahn on The Atom Bomb.